There are others who electrocuted themselves in very bizarre fashions. Another one actually died from carbon monoxide poisoning in his car when he was supposedly cleaning the car inside the garage with the door shut, which
is
a bizarre thing to do.
That same guy had almost died earlier, right?
Well, that's one of the very strange things, that the same guy almost died in a car accident just months earlier. And it was a very weird car accident where he couldn't figure out how it had happened. And there was actually some talk of that privately he told family and friends it was as if something had taken control of his mind and had almost forced him to crash the car. But he prevented that from happening, only to die, as I said, in his garage weeks later. Now, a controversial theory for all this surfaced from a man named Gordon Crichton. Gordon Crichton was the former editor of Flying Saucer Review magazine, a long-standing journal going back to the 50s, but he was also a former intelligence officer with the British military. He came to believe or suspect that the intelligence behind the UFO phenomenon was actually using a kind of mind control to wipe out the SDI scientists. In other words, if SDI, as some people believe, wasn't just aimed at targeting the Russians or the Chinese, but some people believed it was actually targeting hostile extraterrestrials, hence Reagan's warnings. The theory is that the extraterrestrials themselves decided to turn the tables by wiping out the SDI scientists. And it has to be said that there is evidence that mind control did play a role in some of these deaths and bizarre events. Aside from this one, where the guy survived one near-death experience only to then, have a fatal one, there was another case where one of the scientists found himself wandering around France. He lived in England, but found himself, of all places, wandering around France in a haze, in a daze, not even sure how he got there, as if some sort of hypnotic spell had been, sort of instilled in him. And there are a number of cases like that. And as I said, there are more than 30 between 82 and 91. And on such a scale, for me at least, coincidence goes out the window. But the British government stubbornly refused to suggest there was anything to it beyond accidents, heart attacks, depression, and so on. But when you look at the overall picture, clearly there was more going on than that. And I think Gordon Crichton's scenario of, mind control actually being undertaken by hostile aliens to prevent the SDI program going ahead is sort of a fascinating and disturbing one at the same time.
Well, the odds of more than 30 guys working in that one little sector of the defense industry on the same kind of project, that the odds would be off the charts.
Well, you're right.
Then you add in a case like you had one instance where a guy, he eventually died. He killed himself. The guy was in with the engine running and the garage door shut. But a year earlier, he almost killed himself when he was cleaning his gun while it was loaded.
Yeah, this was another case with a Marconi guy. Died in his garage from carbon monoxide poisoning, but just a few months earlier, you're quite right, he'd been cleaning his gun when it was still loaded, and he's actually pointed at his chest and shot himself, and fortunately survived. But he, afterwards, was sort of chilled to the bone. He actually said he couldn't figure out how his mind could have got into such a state where he would have cleaned the gun while it was loaded and pointed at him. Very, very strange. And although I don't mention this in the book, this really kind of parallels the deaths of dozens of microbiologists around the world, many in the U.S., since early 2001, who've been studying exotic viruses and so on. They've kind of dropped like flies, just like the Marconi scientists as well.
You make the point in the book, too, about these Marconi guys, is that not only were they dying off in strange circumstances, but there was also a series of UFO events. I mean, some people tried to explain them away as maybe the IRA had helicopters, which seemed to be a bit of a stretch that they had silent helicopters. But, for the sake of argument, I guess we can include it. But there were at least a couple of intrusions over the Marconi facility, right?
Yeah, I talk about this in the book, where I actually reproduce one of the documents from the British police force that talks about these, as they call them, sort of phantom helicopters or mystery helicopters, because they didn't really know what they were. But they were essentially unidentified flying objects seen over key Marconi installations. And, I don't think that's a coincidence, because one of the installations was the very one where this guy who shot himself in the chest was actually working, and in the same time frame. And, so I think there's a major story here on the Marconi scientists that we've really only seen the tip of. We know of the deaths. What we don't know is, all the background information and what the government itself may have known or suspected that possibly could have been along the lines of Gordon Crichton, sort of like an alien assassination, so to speak.
We'll take a call or two, and then I have a ton of more questions. East of the Rockies, Bonnie in Florida. Good morning, Bonnie. You're on with Nick Redfern.
Good morning, George and Mr. Redfern.
Hey, Bonnie.
My husband was a roommate with Thomas Mantell when they were both cadets in the Air Force.
Oh, my gosh.
And he told me about this, and he said that Thomas Mantell was an extremely intelligent, good pilot, and that he would never do anything stupid. And actually, the story that I had heard previous to the time I met my husband was that this UFO was hanging over Fort Knox for like a week or two. And so they didn't know what to think about it. So somebody, I don't know who, maybe the government or somebody, asked Mantell, he and his group were ferrying planes from someplace. They were together, and they came in, and somebody asked him to check out the UFO that had been there. So he said yes, he would. So several of the fellows went along, but some of them turned back because they thought they didn't have enough fuel or something. And Mantell, being the brave person that he was, he chased after it. So evidently something happened to him then. But my husband knew his wife before they were married. Her name was Peggy. And he said that there was another one of their roommates who later became an attorney, and he helped Peggy try to collect the insurance for Tommy's death because they couldn't prove how he died. Now, I had a picture of my husband and Mantell together, and I had it enlarged, and I sent a copy to his son, whose address I had at one time. I think he lived in Kentucky at the time. And so I've lost the picture. I don't know where it disappeared to. But I thought it was an interesting story because my husband had known Mantell, and that was long before I met him. But he said he was a very intelligent, super good pilot.
Thank you for the call, Bonnie.
Excellent. Thanks, Bonnie. That sort of vindicates what so many other people have said, that, contrary to the idea that Mantell just openly mistook Venus for a UFO, which in the middle of the day when Venus really wouldn't have been in view is sort of absurd. And this goes back to the fact that Mantell was a highly trained and well-respected observer and pilot. And in that sense, this just adds to it. When you get corroboration like this from somebody like your husband who knew him personally, then that, for me, is the sort of thing we always go looking for as a UFO researcher, is where, you can actually add something really significant to the story.
I mentioned earlier in the show about Edward Ruppelt, who was the head of Blue Book, and he sort of had an interesting transformation, or actually a couple of them. He investigated the Mantell case. He said, I forget what the exact words were, but it being weasel words, how the Mantell case was explained. Ruppelt, who was sort of an apologist for Blue Book, he went along with the program for a while, changed his mind, and then changed his mind again. And then, as you note, he died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Tell us that part of the story.
Well, yeah, Ruppelt was the first head of Project Blue Book, as it was known. It actually was a successor to Project Sign and the previous one called Project Grudge, which actually Ruppelt also worked on Grudge as well. But it was really with Blue Book that he came to the forefront. And he was someone who sort of took an enthusiastic and proactive approach to the subject, and actually came to believe that, some UFOs were genuinely probably extraterrestrial. And he wrote a book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, which is a fascinating study when you realize it's actually being written by somebody in the military. Now, You're quite right, George, that after a few years he changed his views and became a little bit more jaded on the subject, and in future editions of the book his views were sort of modified and altered. And it is a fact that in 1960 he died of a heart attack at just 37. It was actually his second heart attack. Now, unfortunately you do sometimes find people die of heart disease at a young age. Maybe that's what happened, but then on the other hand, maybe it isn't. We just don't know. But what we can say for sure is that this was another person who, a major high-profile figure within the UFO history, who died young.
At least the story I had heard, I mean, he was very sympathetic. This is a legitimate topic. There are real mysteries at work here. The stories we've heard is that he was about to do another one, another about-face, and return to his pro-UFO position, and that's when he died. I don't know if that's consistent with what you've heard or not.
Again, it shows the sort of, the smoke and mirrors side of things, where clearly there are things going on in the background where we're not seeing the full picture. But I do find it intriguing that Ruppelt did have this sort of back-and-forth approach to the subject, and there have been rumours that pressure may have been put on him to sort of retract his fairly startling, open view on the subject to one that was more sceptical, and maybe that had some bearing on the overall outcome as well.
We barely have touched on the mutilations subject. You mentioned it just in passing earlier. If we get time, we'll jump into that, because it's one of the most chilling cases that you mentioned. Way more than we can cover in the course of a couple hours. But good stuff here with my guest, Nick Redfern. Welcome back to our final segment with Nick Redfern. We go back to the phones on the wildcard line, Mihilo in Los Angeles. Good morning. You're on with Nick.
Good morning. How are you?
Okay.
Thank you for taking my call. This is really not a question, but I have a piece of information. I knew Dorothy Kilgallen and her husband, Dick Colmar, and their son when I was teaching the son at boarding school in Phoenix, Arizona, called Judson School. And they had a radio program in the morning called Dick and Dorothy. It was a breakfast program, and it issued from their brownstone on 67th Street in Manhattan. And she died under mysterious circumstances just after the assassination of Kennedy. Nobody ever knew. It was diagnosed as cancer. Now, she was perfectly healthy, and all of a sudden, she died of cancer. So I just wondered if he had that piece of information, and I think it's a small but interesting sidelight. She knew quite a bit about what was going on. She was very knowledgeable and quite a personality. She wrote for the New York World Telegram, which was then, there are very few papers, but that was one of the newspapers that was extant at the time.
Oh, yeah, she was a major figure, very popular across the country. Nick?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very interesting, and you're quite right that she did die under very questionable circumstances, and it just sort of adds to the catalogue of unusual deaths that surround the Kennedy assassination. And although she was sort of primarily portrayed as, she took part in a lot of game shows, a very skilled investigative journalist as well. That was what she was more well known for. She was actually sort of a very good journalist, and I actually got hold of her FBI file, which runs to nearly 200 pages, and is filled with copies of her articles that intrigue the FBI, and again demonstrates her skill as a regular journalist.
I think she was really good because she had good contacts. Mihilo, she was well connected, right?
Yes, I think that's the best way of putting it. She was connected pretty high up.
Thank you for the call. I appreciate it. Go ahead, Nick.
In terms of the overall story, this is sort of just another piece of the puzzle, and I think the more pieces we get, one day we're going to get there, hopefully.
Thank you for the call. Appreciate it. We didn't touch on this, but you only briefly, human mutilations. The evidence is not as solid, I think, for these cases as in other parts of your book, but you do touch on this, and it is at least intriguing.
Yeah, well, I felt it was an important issue to touch on, George, because people have spoken about human mutilations, kind of similar to the so-called cattle mutilations. And the main reason I wanted to include this was to see if it would,